Kim, you and Bob Quinn have been doing some very important work with Detroit Public Schools. Can you say a little bit about the purpose of that work and what result you're trying to achieve?
I can. Thanks, Gretchen, for the chance to talk about this. One of the most exciting, engaging activities of my life so far. A couple of years ago, I got a phone call from the assistant superintendent of the Detroit Public School System, who was interested personally in having some kind of leadership development just for himself. And he said, it would also be nice if I could find something for my staff, the people with whom I work. At the time, I was serving as the associate dean in charge of executive education, and I think that's why I got the call for the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. I mentioned to him that our department, the management department, had dedicated time to Detroit. We said, look, we'd like to help the city of Detroit in its renaissance, in its recovery, and its growth. What do we have that we can offer? We don't have $100 million. We don't have the kind of resources that will rebuild buildings. We have knowledge, and we have experience with helping organizations change and flourish. So I said, we have dedicated time. We went to the mayor 3 mayors ago. They didn't have time. 2 mayors ago, they didn't have time. The current mayor, gosh, our agendas are full. We don't have time to come and have you help us develop leaders. He said, wow, that sounds like a good opportunity for us. So he went to the emergency manager at the time, Darnell Early, who was the 4th emergency manager in the Detroit Public School System. His major goal, Darnell Early, was to be the last emergency manager, because they'd had him over and over and over. Nothing got better. So we went to Mr. Early. He said, sure, let's try this. The very first experience that we had was to meet with 110 principals of the schools within the Detroit system. They were actually principals and vice principals. The intent was, let's expose them. Since they are leading schools, let's expose them to something we refer to as positive leadership, the principles that we're studying relating to helping organizations flourish, help individuals flourish, help people become better leaders. That started this wonderful process that's now lasted about 2 years so far, and we're in the beginning stages, I think.
So why would the kind of positive leadership that you teach executives about, global executives from around the world, why would that apply to schools? Why would that be relevant? And what sorts of things might it include?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let me answer that question directly, but I want to paint the picture for you first. Here's what we learned about the Detroit Public School System, and I have some notes to remind me. So the Detroit Public School System was approximately $166 million in debt last year. Over the previous 11 years, there was $1.28 billion in debt. That means there were $7,600 a day being paid in interest. That's $1,200 per student in interest payments. I mean, think of what you could do with $1,200 per student in your classroom per year. There were only 27% of the budget went to actual education expenses. Now, we're talking about 73% of my budget I can't even use. I mean, think about trying to run an organization when you can't even use 3/4 of your budget for what you're intended to do. The school system itself was built back in the heyday of Detroit for approximately 150,000 students. Last year, there were 47,200 students. This year, there are 47,500 students. So we got a 68% diminishing rate. Approximately half of the schools in the Detroit Public School System scored in the bottom 5% on math, history, English, and so on. I mean, performance is at the 5th percentile. Average teacher pay is lower in absolute dollars than 10 years ago. So in adjusted dollars, it's significantly lower. very little professional development. I mean, when you don't have budget, you cut professional development. And I just learned this week, the very best school in the Detroit public school system has an 11% chronic absenteeism rate. The worst school, and there are multiple, have 100% chronic absenteeism rate. So we're starting, I don't know if it's the worst public school system in America, but it's not a good one. So the question is, what in the world do we do about this? And for years and years, they tried all kinds of strategies to pull this system out of the mire that it was in. And one other alternative was to come and say, well, you guys help businesses. Maybe you can help us. We think we can.
So what kind of things do you do in a system where there's such scarce resources, maybe a lack of hope, a lack of disempowerment among these teachers? How do you entice them to see possibilities through the kind of training that you do?
We've had wonderful experiences with them. That first meeting with 100 principals or so, we literally just exposed them to positive principles, positive leadership. And those principles have to do with how you become, as a leader, optimistic, virtuous, meaning compassionate and trustworthy and charitable and compassionate, and things they know about already. But what we did is show them the empirical research that says if you implement those practices, performance of individuals and performance of organization goes up. For example, we even have physiological research that when you demonstrate, for example, positive emotions or virtuous practices like compassionate support and so on, heart rhythms are better, brain waves are better, children learn more. There's one study that shows an 8-fold improvement once people were exposed to positive leadership, optimistic practices. I mean, what we did is, first of all, expose them to the data that says, I know you got problems, I know it's really difficult, but if you think about not only solving problems, but focusing on the opportunities, focusing on the positive possibilities, you can unleash potential in your teachers, in your students, that has not been unleashed for a long, long time. And sure enough, they began buying into that. In fact, in that very first meeting that we were in with the principals, there were tears shed. There were people were very touched by not what we said so much, but by the way they began thinking about how can I turn my school around. Now, it wasn't universal. There were some who said, wait a minute, this is not real. This is not my school. I've got real problems. We're the worst school in the system. We got crime here. We've got suicides here, and so on and so on. But what happened in the room that day, that very first meeting, what happened in the room that day is that other principals said, yeah, but we've had that same problem, and let me tell you what we began doing. One woman in particular said, it's just, I feel like I'm a scapegoat. I feel like I'm a punching bag. I feel like I'm absorbing all the hate and anger and difficulty in this system. But maybe I should just do it because of the kids. These people were so committed to the thriving of the students that I was really touched. One principal said, I'm beginning to define this entire exercise as an exercise in collective forgiveness, forgiving the past difficulties, forgiving the people who have not helped us, forgiving leadership who said they were going to help us, they didn't help us, forgiving the legislature who thinks we're a bunch of bums. He said, I think I can do that. I can clear the slate and start anew. I was so touched by that. Somebody else said, he said, I'm getting paid less than I used to. I get a job offer at least once a year to leave, go someplace besides the Detroit public school system. I'm not willing to sacrifice an entire generation of children. I am committed to this system. I was so impressed by that kind of commitment.
Yeah. Sounds like purpose is a big
Yes.
piece of it. Purpose of why are we doing this? It's for the kids.
Corrective.
Is that an explicit topic that you cover?
Between my friend Bob Quinn and I, Bob's focus primarily is on identifying a higher purpose. And he'll talk a lot about that as he teaches. And it helps open up for people authentic conversations, deep feelings, kind of what we call core stories, things that are especially meaningful. That creates a wonderful climate. That has to be coupled with the hard-nosed science data, and that's sort of me. Bob jokes with me that I'm a robot. He's the feeling guy, you know.
I don't think he jokes. I think you joke with him about that because we know it's not true. You're working with the leadership of these schools. So what are the kind of things that you're teaching these leaders about how to bring out the best in their teachers?
Yeah,
Because the teachers aren't the ones that you're working with. So how are you empowering them to create the right kind of context so that the teachers can actually execute the kind of things that you're talking about?
Such an important question. One of the things we know from research is that between 20 and 30% of the variance in performance in organizations, healthcare, education, business, financial services, military, 20 to 30% is a product of the leader. So strategy matters, culture matters, processes matter, incentive systems matter, but all of those things can be in place, and if you have an idiot or a jerk for a leader, it's not going to work. So the leader is not the most important, but it's a very important part. In fact, the most important part of the equation for helping an organization flourish. So the senior leaders in this organization have said, we believe that we're going to get the best bang for the buck by focusing on the leaders. So we have had, in the last 2 years, 5 or 6 sessions with different sets of leaders. One was, for example, we brought 90 people who they identified as a transformation team. It was the emergency manager, the superintendent and his staff, the representative sample of principals, a representative sample of teachers, and a representative sample of other units that have to do with the Detroit public school system. We spent 2.5 days on the University of Michigan campus. We simply donated the hotel rooms, we donated the food, we donated the equipment, and they said, this is going to be the team that will turn around this system. That is, we're now charging ourselves to be the leaders of the Renaissance. That was followed by meetings with smaller groups. It was followed by some strategic planning sessions. And just this week, in September 2016, we had a session where they took 125 central administrators, that is, these are the people who are sitting in central administrative positions, off-site into a campgrounds and spent a day with them. I loved it. It was wonderful. For some of these people, it's the first time this had ever happened. And the reason we did it is because the legislature has now essentially created a new Detroit public school system. The old system gets the debt, the new system starts afresh. There's a brand new interim superintendent who has been involved in the process all the way along. This is a brand new start of a school year, so lots of new things going on. So we said, all right, let's take this moment and craft a day that will try to help uplift, give perspective, set some goals, identify some strategies, and move forward for the year. One of the questions or one of the tasks that I assigned these people was to write down their ideas about how central administration could support master teachers, excellent teachers, spectacular education in the schools, in the classroom. Now, the reason that's important is because central administration is normally seen as the enemy. They're blockers rather than supporters. They're naysayers rather than helpers. They're people who create policy and bureaucracy rather than clearing it out of the way. They're people who superimpose on us rules and procedures we don't like as opposed to freeing us up. They're seen as not those guys. Mm-hmm. Given that circumstance, we said, all right, central administrators, 125 of you, what can you do to ensure excellence in the classroom? 68 ideas. I loved it. I mean, they are really serious, and we had them commit to doing these kinds of things. And in some cases, it's just getting out of the way. In fact, some of those statements have to do with let's get out of the way, let's remove barriers. And some of it had to do with we're really serious. For example, we ought to go visit schools once in a while and see what's going on in a classroom, and so on. 68 commitments. Now, let's say each one of those 68 produces a 1% change. That's 68% change. And by the way, that would be a revolution. If 5% change would be a revolution. So I'm pretty optimistic that starting at that place that matters, that leadership group, there, and now they know about positive leadership, about the practices. I mean, for example, I'll give you one practice. It's common practice now because the research is so compelling. One of the practices that pays off in a remarkable way is for people to keep a gratitude journal. Now, what does that mean? That means 5 minutes before you go to bed tonight, review the day and simply pick the 3 things that occurred for which you're grateful, or the 3 best things that happened to you today. Some of the research that shows that it pays off are things like this. If I have a group of people who are keeping a gratitude journal, students, for example, and a group of people who are not keeping a gratitude journal, but are in fact keeping a journal, just writing down 3 events that occurred. Here are some of the studies. If I give everyone a flu shot, and then I test for the number of antibodies in their system 7 days later, 1 week later, those keeping a gratitude journal have more antibodies in their system. They're healthier at the end of 1 week, a physiological difference. I can give them a mental acuity task. What's that? You have to remember information. You have to memorize information. You have to come up with sophisticated decision rules for complex data. Those keeping a gratitude journal have more mental acuity. They do better on tests. They remember longer. They memorize more accurately. I give them a creativity task. What's a creativity task? Well, think of all the things you can use a ping pong ball for, or a brick, or a pencil. More ideas in the gratitude journal group, broader variety of ideas, more mental flexibility. That is, and there are many, many more studies. That is, I can actually affect the way people learn, their physiological situation, and so on. So one study of many, one tool or technique of many, we expose these people to, and they say, you know what, we might be able to use this and affect the lives of our children, affect our own lives, affect the lives of people in a classroom. And so over time, we're hoping that at the very grassroots level, things start turning around, as well as the stuff at the strategic level, more efficiency, better use of resources, getting rid of the obstacles and blocks that keep systems and especially classrooms and especially teachers from being able to do their job.
So this question is very specific.
Okay.
So we're going to have a lot of principals who are going to be viewing this video, and they're going to get excited about some of the things that you've just been sharing, and they go back to their schools and are talking to their teachers. Teachers are cynical.
Yes.
It's like, I don't know if I get this. Really what I need is, classroom with updated technology, and I need better desks, and I need, resources to ensure my students get to school. What do you say to those principals? What advice can you give to them about how to respond to a teacher who might be cynical and in a system where there is a lack of hope?
Yeah. At least certainly a lack of resources that we normally think, I need this in order to flourish or thrive. Well, My approach is different than others. I feel like the first thing I have to do is expose people to the research that shows that if you implement positive practices, it pays off. How does it pay off? It pays off in terms of being able to learn more. It pays off in terms of being healthier mentally, emotionally, physically. It pays off in terms of being open to new information. So I'm thinking about these children in a classroom in a very difficult situation in Detroit or in the back hills of Arkansas or other places where there just aren't very many resources. I'm not probably going to affect very much of the financial resources available to those people. What I can do is affect the emotional, mental, social resources available, and that is the key to learning well. For example, I was, in my past life, I was the dean of a business school, and I was meeting at the time with the CEO of a big corporation, asking him for money. That's what deans do. And he was telling me that they had taken over as a company one of the schools in an inner city, not Detroit, but another inner city. He said, we did an analysis, that's what we do, to try to figure out what they needed. And he said, we knew, of course, that what they needed was just more money. But we sent out a bunch of analysts, they did the analysis, came back, money wasn't on the top three. The number one need, they said, is we need more social workers. I said, why social workers? They said, because what's happened in our schools is that Mary Sue won't show up to the first grade for 3 days in a row. We'll call her mother, and her mother will say, yeah, well, she's just playing video games or watching TV till midnight. I can't get her awake. And in the morning, and they'll say to her, well, you have to get your daughter to school. And the mother, the trouble is, thinks of the school as an enemy because they've always been an enemy in her life. They haven't been a facilitator. They haven't been compassionate. They haven't been supportive. They haven't created positive energy in her. It's all been punishment and the opposite. So they said what we need to do is, first of all, train moms and daughters that this is a place for them to flourish. We need to turn around the way they think about what we're doing here. All right, that's just a cue for me that what we teach is not so much I'll hand you money, but it rather is let's change the way you think about what we're about here. We're going to help you become the best you can be, and so on. So those are some of the principles associated with positive leadership, and there are tools and techniques. Now, my first approach, back to the question, my first approach is here's the data. Very compelling data that shows your heart rhythms are better, your brain rhythms, lots of things change that are very compelling when you implement positive, virtuous practices. Second is, okay, once I've got you convinced, let's talk about very specific activities you can do in your classroom or in the school as a whole that will help unleash that potential. See, I believe virtually, I mean, 0.01% probably are exceptions. Virtually 99.99% of students are able to learn and flourish. Now, we all have different abilities, but everybody can grow. We are built to grow. Theoretically, we call that the heliotropic effect. Now, that's what in the world is the heliotropic effect? That's way too academic. But let me explain it because it matters. If you put a plant in a window, over time it leans toward the light, which is an example of the heliotropic effect, which is defined as follows. Every living system, everything alive, has a tendency toward the light and away from dark, or toward positive energy away from negative energy. See, in nature, the sun is a source of positive energy. It's the life-giving force. Its photosynthesis depends on the sun. Most accurately defined, the heliotropic effect is every living system has a tendency toward that which is life-giving and avoids or is repelled by that which is life-endangering or depleting, which makes sense. Over time, every species is attracted to that which gives life and is repelled by that which endangers or detracts from life. All right, if that's true, if every person flourishes in the presence of the positive and languishes in the presence of the negative, the way we treat them, the way we teach them, the way we incent them, the way we try to get them to school every day matters a lot, because they will respond to positive energy and they will avoid or be repelled by or resist negative energy. So we convince people, it takes an hour to show 5% of the data, to show, you know what, students will flourish in the presence of positive energy. So how might you do that, teacher or principal or superintendent or school district or school board? And all of those coordinated together could create something wonderful. I'm betting on the Detroit public school system to create something wonderful.
Well, thank you, Kim. And clearly you're modeling some of that heliotropic effect in this interview, but also in the important work that you're doing with Detroit Public Schools.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you so much for
being
what
here.
you're doing. This is a hero, or a heroine, rather. This is an extraordinary person right here.